Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I'm the author of the newly released book, The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we're speaking with James Day. He's a long-term researcher and speaker on the Shroud and other Christian themes, and as well as a published author. And today, he's got some really interesting information on some of the later history of the Shroud after the Fourth Crusade. So definitely looking forward to that. But before we get going, let me give you a brief background on James. James's work has been regularly published in a variety of outlets since 2013. Among his writings are numerous essays on the Shroud of Turin. He is the author of 4 books, and his next book is due out in the late 2024, and it's going to be on the medieval world at the time of the Shroud and as it appeared in the historical record. He is a producer and manager for EWTN television in California. James, welcome, and so glad to have you.
I'm honored to be here, Guy, and thank you for bringing me on.
Absolutely. And definitely looking forward to hearing about the history because that period there is kind of the hidden history. So before we get started, though, why don't you tell us your backstory on how you got involved in the Shroud of Turin?
I was a student. I went to Catholic school, but the shroud was never really a part of our curriculum or education. And I think this was because this was in the almost immediate years after Carbon 14 came out in 1988. Carbon 14 saying 1260 to 1390 was the probable origin of the shroud. So I think from an education standpoint, I think a lot of people, and I think that really that news really ground shroud studies to a halt in general for a good time, at least maybe 10 years. I would say
Mm.
maybe until Wilson's 1998 book came out and started to after the fire in Turin of 97. And I think that really started to maybe rethink uh, the Shroud's approach and new scientific tests and such. So from that perspective, I really didn't think much about the Shroud at all. And it was really, I would say, in the early 2010s, I started to get a real fascination with the Veronica, with the Holy Face icon and imagery and the history of just the icon of Christ's face on the cloth. And from there, you started to distill theories which can be misconstrued often as fact. But that's for another, maybe that's for down the road. But I started to see there were connections being made between the Veronica and the Shroud. There were similarities in this image. And then, then I started to really become interested in the full image of the Shroud and what that meant. It really started a journey that took a long time. And really in 2018, I said, okay, I'm going to sit down and try to get to the bottom of it. Which became quite a journey because
Yeah.
there were a lot of threads, quite a rabbit hole. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. That's really what we're going to be talking about today is what I uncovered in the sense of so many questions about how the Shroud got to France, why it got to France, and what happened when it was in France. Because we know it as the Shroud of Turin, we know it as an Italian object. Really, it's the Shroud of Leary, and what that means. So that's sort of the brief backstory. And it's been about 5 years now, off and on with some research.
Hmm.
I've met a lot of folks. I've met Father Spitzer and others that I've interviewed. Ian Wilson I've chatted with directly. I've tried to get as much as I can in many languages. A lot of interlibrary loan books were taken out. And still to this day, the connection between the Veronica image and the Shroud, I think, is something that I can't ignore because I think that is very critical to how the Shroud was presented to the people in Leary.
Mm. Well, and the Veil of Veronica is also kind of an interesting topic and certainly related to research on the Shroud and stuff like that. But before we get into that, I mentioned that you have a book coming out. Why don't you give us a couple of sentences on that, and then we can move on to the history.
The result of my research, which I mentioned was that started in 2018, is the result of that research. This is that manuscript. The working title is The Fraud of Turin.
Hmm.
Because I'm specifically focusing on the medieval landscape in which the shroud emerged, and we know there's a lot of controversy about that. What I think is overlooked often in shroud studies is the just overwhelming milieu of the fixation, the emphasis, and devotion that people had on the Passion of Christ, and how that was manifested in various rituals and devotions and symbols, and all of that, and iconography, and a lot of that is times corresponds with the shroud's emergence, which was not the only shroud in Christendom at the time. I mean, this was one of many that were claimed to be the burial cloth of Christ. So I break down because there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of great visuals that I found that show these devotions, and they correspond a lot with what was going on in Leary with the shroud. So I don't come down one way or the other on authenticity. My focus was on the milieu of,
Mm.
say, 1350s France and greater Christendom.
Yeah. Well, in 1354 is really when it really historical evidence appeared in Liray, France, with or the shroud, or what's believed to be the shroud. But then, of course, like you said, there were many imposters, certainly, that also came up at that time. And yeah, very interesting, very interesting. And that period from 1350 forward, but also 1350 backward. And so let's start talking about that. So 1204 was the Fourth Crusade. There is reasonable evidence that Robert de Clary saw the shroud in Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. And then after that, the history is a little bit murky, and there's maybe some various disconnects there. So tell us about what your thinking is there.
Yeah, it's murky for sure, but there's compelling threads to follow. I mean, it's even murky with De Clary. Now, De Clary was a knight, I believe he was from Picardy. So he was a Frankish knight who, now there you can even make the argument that he himself was not in the church of I think it was Saint Mary Blanchernay. I could be wrong,
Mm.
that he himself, he heard this from somebody. We don't know if it was actually he himself who was in there who saw this. What does sound like the shroud, a full image that was venerated by the faithful, that was shown. Now this was Byzantine, this was Byzantium, this was Constantinople, this was the Orthodox Eastern Empire. This was not Roman. This was not the Latin West. So this was an entirely a new world for these Frankish knights.
Mm.
And you were mentioning how I didn't really know much about the shroud growing up as a student. And I didn't know much about the shroud. I didn't know much about the Crusades either. That was something that wasn't really discussed in terms of education and curriculum. Once you start looking into that whole fascination, you can't separate the Crusades from the presence of the shroud, in my opinion. Because really, what is the shroud but the empty tomb brought to you directly, in terms of, and I say you as in the faithful, what that is when it's displayed, and look at it is behind you there, that 1600 engraving, or so, that is the visual representation of the empty tomb brought to the people. So if one could, the whole point of the Crusades was a journey to the Holy Land for pilgrims to be able to access the holiest sites of Christendom. And what was the holiest site of Christendom but the Holy Sepulchre? Now, once that was taken away from the Christians after the fall of the whole Latin kingdom, if one could not journey to Jerusalem, then the empty tomb, or Jerusalem, was brought to you. So the transfer of relics, for instance, is a great example of that. So by the time of the Fourth Crusade, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was in peril. By now, it's only really in Cyprus at this point. It's not even in Jerusalem anymore, or really the Holy Land. So it's a very small thing. And the Fourth Crusade gets diverted for whatever reason. it was a real travesty what happened to the people in Constantinople. But the Franks ransacked Constantinople and destroyed it and looted it and pillaged it and propped up as you know, I mean, it propped up this basically a pretend empire, the Latin kingdom of the Latin Empire of Constantinople. So you have the very ignoble and inappropriate Frankish knights hoisted up to the throne of Byzantium as claiming to be Byzantine emperors for about 60 years. So in that milieu, what's very interesting though is that really it's a Frankish, and when I say Frankish, that's modern day France, but there were other kingdoms and principalities within this environment. It was mostly a Frankish armies that descended upon Constantinople. But you start seeing that these are all very connected families, nobility. The Middle Ages was a time of nobility. This, you know, if you were a peasant, you're forgotten. We don't know who you are, and we'll never know who you are. But this was a time of nobles. The nobles were very well connected. They were very well connected to Templar families that they supported Templars, in their environment, and they supported the local Cistercian monasteries or convents or abbeys. So they were very well connected to the church, to military chivalric orders, and to crusading. Once you start realizing who was at the Fourth Crusade, you start seeing the ancestors of Geoffrey de Charnay, and that's who was the first knight. That whose church is where the shroud first emerged. For those who don't know, for the shroud first emerged, as you said, Guy, about 1354 in Léry, France, at Geoffrey de Charnay, who was a French knight, at his church. His ancestors dominate the Fourth Crusade, and as well as ancestors of nobles of Charnay's time. So you start seeing these family connections, and you can make a case that if the Shroud of Turin was in Constantinople as one of those great relics venerated by the Byzantine East, then it could have been transferred out of Constantinople to France by one of these family members. And there have been cases made about that, as you know. So I did follow those lines as much as I could, but it's ultimately inconclusive if that's how indeed it got to France. So I don't think we can say that with any certainty that, say, for instance, Othan de la Roche, who was the Duke of Athens, and maybe 6 generations up the line to Descharnay's second wife. So people say, well, maybe that's how it got to him, for instance. It is inconclusive, but I think it's compelling though, and it takes people down that road. But I don't think it's there. I really don't. My interest, and we can get into this, focused on Serbia,
Yeah.
which occurred well after the Fourth Crusade, but it was still another crusade. But from a Fourth Crusade standpoint, that's a little bit of the backstory of Fourth Crusade and its possible interest in the Shroud, but inconclusive ultimately.
Yeah, yeah. And there seems to be one or two two theories for certain. There's probably 100 more, but the two main ones are either Othon de la Roche, and he took it up to his home in Regnier, France, and Burgundy, or then it was somehow traded as part of a transaction between Baldwin and the King of France, and uncertain exactly what happened there. And there's good arguments in both cases. There's really, there seems to be evidence one way and seems to be evidence another way. But well, so you brought up the Serbia connection. Let's talk about the Serbia connection and how it's how you bring that all into this history of the Shroud of Turin.
Sure. It's easy to get over, as you know this, it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the names and all the potential theories. And you just mentioned 2 of them, which are compelling enough, and one can get really ensnared in those. So a good way is looking at the life of Descharnay himself. Geoffrey de Charnay. We think he was born around 1300, 1305. We know he died in 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers. He was a lifetime soldier. He was counselor to the king. He was the grandson of Jean de Joinville, who was also close to Louis IX, who was Saint Louis IX of France, which is another possible way in which the shroud may have come, was through de Joinville. Either way, he's connected to nobility, he's connected to the kings of France, and he's a career soldier above all. So he's not around much. So he is traveling all over the place. At one point, he gets kidnapped and he ends up as a prisoner in England during the Hundred Years' War. But he also went on crusade, a very unknown crusade, but one that's called the Smyrna Crusade, if I'm pronouncing this right. Pardon me, Guy, for some of these pronunciations.
I don't know him either. I had a friend of mine at church. He would say it doesn't matter how you pronounce them. If you pronounce them with energy and feeling, people will just go with it. So it doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah, good. That's good. Now Smyrna was near Turkey, which is near in the general area of Constantinople. But this is way after the Fourth Crusade. This is way after the fall of Christendom. By now, we're seeing the crumbling of the medieval landscape. This is very late Middle Ages. This is about 13. This is in the 1340s. Charnay goes, which is also very interesting because he goes on crusade and it's supposedly 1344 to 1346. And yet by August of 1346, he's back fighting the Hundred Years' War in France at Crécy, if I'm pronouncing that right. So even his presence in the first or second Smyrna Crusade is questionable. But so why this? Well, when the knights going over to Smyrna, the port that they left from was Bari, was in Italy on the eastern side. There's a church there. I should say first that particular area of Italy is rife with a lot of back and forth traffic to the east. Okay. So particularly you have right there. I mean, you have modern day Croatia and Bosnia, Serbia. That's
Yeah,
important.
and just for a kind of a geographic reference, so that's the northeastern side of Italy. It's down by the heel of the boot of Italy, and that's the Adriatic Sea. And then to your point, on the other side of that is Greece further down, and then you've got Croatia, modern day Croatia, Serbia, whatever it is, all of those countries right there. And so there is a lot of action, and certainly if you were traveling even from Constantinople, that might be one of the first areas that you hit as you're traveling west to get even to Europe or to Spain.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great because so I think it shows that there was a lot of movement for a time that we think was maybe very, one state on their farm the whole time. I mean, absolutely, I was quite international. And so you had Brindisi and then the port city of Bari. And in Bari was the Church of San Nicola, which is now a pontifical basilica with its relics of St. Nicholas, who is a major figure in both East and West Christianity. What's interesting about that is that there is a kind of so there's a Serbian presence there that we know of because of its connection with Saint Nicholas, and Saint Nicholas was a huge figure in Serbian Christianity tradition. So while there, we think he probably went there or certainly had some interaction there. But there's another church nearby called Santa Maria del Casale in Brindisi. So this is just north of Bari. And there you see Geoffrey de Charnay's coat of arms with other insignia from the Crusaders of the Smyrna Crusade. And so that shows that he was there as part of the Smyrna Crusade uh, detail. That shows that he was there, that he spent some time in these port cities that had heavy influence from the East. My thought is that he was gifted, or at least in this particular argument, he was gifted the shroud as a gift, rolled up in a chest while he was in at this port city
Hmm.
by representatives from the Serbian court who also counted Bari and that particular area as their land, as their home as well. Okay. I believe from this argument, he didn't know what it was. I believe it was maybe part of a series of things that were collected, whatever. He's a career soldier. He's on crusade. He's not. I think that we know he joined the Order of the Star in the 1350s. There's a table fountain that exists at the Cleveland Museum of Art from the Order of the Star from that time, meaning there was tons of generous and elaborate things being passed around if you were in that particular milieu. To me, I don't think he thought twice about this particular thing that he was given, let's just say. Now, I want to say though, what is it about Serbia? Well, Serbia, first off, let's go back to the Veronica. One of the most important images of the Veronica is the Holy Face of Leon. The Holy Face of Leon, which tradition has Jacques Pantaleon, who became Pope Urban IV, obtained that very amazing image of Christ in Bari, in this same area where Charnay is, about 100 years earlier.
Hmm.
And he sent it to his sister, who is a nun in France. But he obtained it in the same place where Charnay would be about 100 years later. What's interesting is that there's writing on that particular icon, which if you
So
look at it,
sorry, let me
yeah,
interrupt you
please.
there. So what's it called from Leon? It's called
The Holy Face of Leon.
the Holy Face of Leon, and that is a copy of the Veil of Veronica, or that is the Veil of Veronica?
It's an icon. It's an icon of the Holy Face.
Okay.
It's not necessarily, one way or the other. I mean, it's just an icon,
Yeah.
an
Okay.
artistic icon, but one that is extremely well known. And what's interesting about it is that there's Slavonic writing on it,
Hmm.
which means So, it says that it implies that Serbia, Bulgaria, or Russia could
Hmm.
have been the beginnings, where that
Yeah.
particular icon was produced. So the Serbia angle is very interesting because you can build on that. So now we have
Hmm.
this holy face of Leon, but it was obtained by Pope Urban IV in Bari from probably Serbian origins. And we still sit on Serbia because Serbia had this wonderful devotion, which is all over the Orthodox East, but in particular Serbia, called the Epitaphios.
Hmm.
Epitaphios. Should we do a description
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
for what
let's do
that
that.
for folks? You could just type it in and it comes up beautiful images. It basically is a cloth that is set out um, at in rituals in church services, but it's specifically set out because it has the supine Christ as if entombed, as if he appears on the shroud. The frontal part of image should be noted in the same position with the hands over and lying flat. And this is a very elaborate and delicate and beautifully woven icon that's a tradition in the Orthodox East. And what's really interesting is that at this very time, about the early 1300s, there are that still exist today are an epitaphios dedicated to the king of Serbia. So it has his name on it. We know Milutin is the king's name. So you punch that in, you find out he was king around the same time as what we're talking about, 1300s. And it's a very strikingly shroud-like
Mm.
image. So I would encourage folks to look up the epitaphios, and that also is a Serbian origin. So now we have the holy face, and now we have a full-on image of Christ that's venerated in Serbia, all which is also an entombed or a funeral devotion specific to that particular. So it's almost as if one is connecting the burial of Christ and the body of the dead Christ with the body of, say, the fallen king, or another individual who has died, and the services are connecting those two. I make that point because when Charnay dies in 1356, his body is never brought back to Liry, even though he wanted to be buried there. He dies on the battlefield of Poitiers, and it takes about 14 years for his remains to be collected, and he's buried in the Church of the Celestians, which is unfortunately no longer around. But my point is, it's interesting that the shroud comes up after or right around Charnay dies at Poitiers. And in a way, it might be a way of commemorating the
Mm.
body of the knight whose church this shroud is in, who can't be buried there, in the same way that the epitaphios in Serbia commemorates the dead,
Mm.
of King Milutin. So those are just some very brief Serbian connections. I'll
Yeah,
toss it
that's
back over to you.
yeah, no, 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 that's fascinating. And so, and do you know what the relationship was between the Serbs and the Bulgarian or the Bulgars, and then even Ukraine and the Kievan Rus, and because you have then that whole point of the I think it was in about the 1100s, you have the Byzantine Empire more or less losing to the Bulgars, but then they made a deal that they would marry the sister of the emperor, Anna Porphyrogenita, and then that kind of Christianized all of Ukraine, all of Russia, and then I'm wondering if that also influenced then Bulgaria, now modern day Bulgaria, and then Serbia.
Certainly, I believe so. What from my perspective, you have Saint. Well, she's venerated as a saint in the Serbian Orthodox Church, and that's Saint Helen, or Saint Helena, who's the mother of King Milutin. Um,
Mm.
I don't have it right in front of me necessarily, but now she has. What's interesting is that, again, to your point, you're focusing more on going even further east, and there's certainly that. But there was so much interplay with the West, even
Mm.
though technically there was an excommunication between Orthodox and Latin after 1054. However, because of the way these kingdoms were, there was so much intermarrying and
Mm.
intermixing that you had that Latin presence one way or the other. And Helen it's Helen of Anjou, Angou. That the part in France, right? That we have so many kings that came out of that part, a very important part of France, Anjou. But that's Helen of
Mm.
Anjou, who's
Mm.
over in Serbia. So you see that kind of bridge there, and what's bridging them ultimately is the faith, is
Mm.
Christianity. That is what's
Mm.
rooting these two. And I believe, particularly, I think in that phenomenon of the body of Christ, that empty tomb in the Holy Sepulchre, which the Christians cannot access, or if they can, it's on a very limited basis based on the Sultan.
Right.
Uh, you know, so this is to them. It's the man. It's a sorrowful time. So what better way but to commemorate the man of sorrows in a way that an illiterate populace would really connect with, and that's through the visual means. That's through
Mm.
visually showing what this man of sorrows endured. Um,
Mm.
you know, so that's
So are you thinking that the it's possible that the shroud went through Serbia and then over to Bari and then up through Geoffrey de Charny up to France as another possibility there?
Yes, that's ultimately what I'm making the argument for, without
Hmm.
really getting into maybe then, because then it becomes like who created the creator? Well, then where did it come
Yeah, yeah.
for Serbia? But without maybe getting down too much into that, I would say what happened once it got back with Charnay. So let's just say in this theory, he
Hmm.
has he has it rolled up in a chest and
Hmm.
he takes it back home, but he does not yet. Now, this is the 1340s. He does not yet have his church in Leary yet. That's coming. So, what does he do? In my theory, he has it stored. And as I mentioned to you at the top, there was so much interconnection with local abbeys and monasteries and convents between these families that he had it stored at a local um, Cistercian Benedictine monastery. He had it
Hmm.
particularly called Montier de la Selle, which is just, and that actually shows up. That church shows up in the documents when he was founding the his church in Leary. He needed a approval of maybe
Mm.
from the abbot, or to do that. It
Yeah,
was something
yeah.
like that. So I think he stored it there. That got overrun during the Hundred Years' War in
Hmm.
1359. That was ransacked and
Mm.
destroyed. So that may have, as a way of saving things that were there, that's when it came to Leary,
Mm.
because ultimately it was Charnay who brought it to Montier-la-Selle. Now, why do I say that? Well, we know that his good friend Walter of Brienne, Gauthier of Brienne in the French, um, who also died at Poitiers in 1356 alongside Descharnay. He had a key to a lock, basically a locker in Montier-la-Selle. So to me, I read that and I said, boy, that is interesting. I mean, who that's something we, of course, sure. What a great storage place for someone to just they're traveling so much, and that's a safe place where they can keep things. I read that detail, and by the way, Walter the Sixth was also an Order of the Star member. So it's not out of, and he comes from the Brienne line, who were the
Hmm.
kings, the emperors of that ill-fated Latin Empire of Constantinople. So my point is it's not out of the realm of possibility that Walter the Sixth knew Charnay got something from a Serbian envoy and that it was stored in this particular monastery for a certain time.
Hmm.
Um, I think because ultimately, Guy, no one knows how it got to Leary,
Yeah.
and you can take two examples. We don't really only have quickly. We really only have a few passages from his relatives and the bishop of Troyes, who makes very passing comments about where the shroud came from. Well, my grandfather obtained it in war, and without really going into any detail, so, or it was gifted to him, or the bishop of Troy says, well, this was a cunningly painted, and it was used to trick the populace after Charnay's death. Um, I think once what we can get into all sorts of things about what happened once it got there. But in my theory about Serbia, that's it. Serbia, through the across the Adriatic to Bari,
Mm.
which was heavy Serbian location. And I mentioned some of those churches that you can look at, St. Nicholas, for instance. We know Charnay was there. We see his coat of arms at the church. We know he was at the Smyrna Crusade. We know he likely knew nothing about the shroud because he was a writer. He was published. He was a poet. He made no mention of it. There's no mentions of it in the Act of Foundation. So he may have just put it away and forgot about it until it was necessary that it be brought out. And why? Because he dies and he leaves a wife with a young child, and that and Jean de Verger needs funding. And we
Mm.
know she asked for funding from the king, basically to get Charnay's cash in a way. I'm teasing it down to
Yeah,
various
yeah,
details.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so we know that there were some financial issues in post 1356. We know France was being overrun in the Hundred Years' War. We know that there was a ton of shrouds and other things, either relics or imposters, that were being displayed at that time for pilgrims, for donations, for
Mm.
to help a particular church. It also could be made that the shroud was really in possession of the canons of Leary, that
Mm.
they were the ones who really propped this up as a thing to be a force to be reckoned with in Leary, that maybe they were the ones connected, say, to the Benedictines or the Cistercians and something like that. And we know that there was a big fight between the canons of Leary and the descendants of Descharnay over ownership of the
Yeah,
ship
yeah.
up until the very end. I mean, Charnay's daughter dies in about 1460 or so, excommunicated, a
Mhm.
total outcast. She's this wandering. She's trying to peddle the shroud to whoever will take it. So she was really holding on to that as her livelihood until the very end. So there's a lot of conflict there.
Well, and it's funny. So that was, and who you're talking about there is Marguerite de Charny, and but and even then you have the Bishop of Troyes claiming that it was fake because he had the real one, maybe, or he was getting jealous of all the money the Leray canons were bringing in, and to some extent, it all comes down to the lucre. It all comes down to the money, and
Yeah,
uh, and it's also fascinating because it's then the Duke of Savoy that actually makes the transaction with Marguerite de Charny to, first of all, to recommunicate her, and then second of all, to buy the shroud upon her death, so that she would have some money to live on. And then in the 1450s, when she finally dies, or the 1430s, I don't remember exactly, where then she bequeaths it, so to speak, over to the Duke of Savoy.
yeah, for
Yeah, yeah.
1450s.
Well,
Uh,
and you brought up something else too, which I
yeah,
always think is fascinating, is even if you were able to find some written proof that the shroud, hey, I have the Shroud of Turin, here it is, and I'm the man. And one of the things that I've found as I've been talking to, and interviewing folks and reading about things, is that there's three types of writings. There's a writing that is absolutely true. There is a writing that is false, but purported to be true because the writer wants it to be true so that he can embellish his record. And then there's the total forgeries, where somebody wrote the forgery and did it on purpose because he could then make money off of the forgery. And so one of the challenges that we all have, especially, is even if we were to find something in writing that said, "Hey, I've got it in Serbia, or I have it in Athens with Othon de la Roche, or I've got it in Liray," that it takes a lot to really corroborate that writing is actually true. That it's really, really true.
yeah, yeah, agreed. And it's doubtful that may be unearthed still. We're hoping that
Yeah,
there's something
yeah,
untranslated out there. Uh, but if you back it up with enough evidence, even if you can make circumstantial claims, as I was trying to say with Serbia in the devotion of the Holy Face and the Epitaphios, and there's certainly a lot of movement there in that regard.
yeah, yeah.
I do want to point out, if I can, real quick, that at the very time this was all going on, the church was in schism. The Roman Church was in schism at the time, and so you had the Pope in Rome, and you had the Pope in
In
France, right?
in starts with an A, is
Avignon,
Avignon. That's it.
Avignon.
Yep.
So the Avignon Pope was the Pope to whom Geoffrey
Mm.
de Charnay was serving. So it's that particular Robert of Geneva is the Pope there. That particular Pope is the one who is handling uh, a lot of the criticism and controversies that either the bishop is sending to him, or when Charnay's son appeals things about representing the shroud, and it's the Pope who says, well, you have permission to show it, but you can't say it's the actual cloth, those kind of things. And
Mm.
that's important because it's a fractured time, and it's not as unified as a lot of people thought. And that also meant that, say, French or Frankish devotees or worshipers were prohibited from going to Rome. So in 1350, you had the Jubilee of 1350, which was a widely popular event, so much so that folks were trampled on, because there were so many people that were crossing the
Mm.
bridge and stuff. And what was the great attraction? Nowadays, you go to, if you're that particular worshiper, you're going to Rome and you're hoping to maybe glimpse the Pope. But it wasn't so much the Pope then who was the draw; it was the Holy Face. It was
Mm.
the Veronica that was in Rome, kept in St. Peter's at that time. And
Mm.
we have drawings of, similar to that, to there in the background, of the Holy Face being displayed to the people. And we have writings about how even Dante, in the Divine Comedy, talks about the beauty and the draw of the Veronica, as it was called. That drew a lot of pilgrims. It generated a lot for the
Mm.
economy, which was nothing as what Rome is today in terms of, I mean, it was, there were sheep grazing, in the Roman Forum kind of thing.
Mm.
So if you're in a schismatic church, and if you're another pope, but that looks really interesting. Or if you're not even just the pope, if you're someone who has means, and you hear from pilgrims coming back, they even had pilgrim badges where they could put the little, affix the Veronica little badge saying, I saw the Veronica, or, they put it on their
Mm.
hats or something, as a way of, showcasing their devotion. This is really interesting for those who can maybe put together a presentation, who have the means to do it, as a way of drawing pilgrims. And if you look at the map, you know that Leary is on the way to the Camino de Santiago from the
Mm.
from the French route.
Mm.
And so, these were pilgrims all over the place, passing by, Germany, passing through, etc. So there was foot traffic, you know,
Mm.
there was foot traffic there. And at a time that in which war and the Black Plague was happening, there, this was a way of drawing pilgrims in, you know, and that's a lot of the actual documentation that we do have, is talking about things about
Mm.
showcasing the shroud. And it's all within the late 1380s, 1390s. And they say, well, it was shown 34 years ago, and then it was put away for 30 years, and then it was brought out. So one could even make an argument that, did Geoffrey Descharnay the first even have it, or did it show up under Geoffrey II? So
Mm.
there's still some questions there. But yeah, I think the Pilgrim Trail is also the Pilgrim Trail, the 1350 Jubilee, and the prominence of the Veronica are
Yeah.
things that can't be ignored when you're looking at the prominence of the shroud, and also how territorial the shroud was. We think of it now as this world famous icon, which it is. At the time, though, nobody knew about it.
Mm.
Only a select few. The Pope in Avignon, maybe the king, the local diocese, uh, but that's it. That was not it wasn't the big draw that it is today. And really, you can credit Savoy, the House of Savoy, for bringing that to our attention.
Yeah.
At the
Yeah.
time, it's one little controversy among all sorts of controversies going on during the Western Schism.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because you have the Western Schism, and then of course you have the East-West and the Great Schism, but you have all these different plays for power. You have the economies going up and down, and then now you mentioned the Black Plague and the death and the destruction that plague well, in any plague, but that particular plague had on Europe as a whole, and on France and Italy and whatever. So tell us how that kind of plays into this whole story.
I think it's another thing that you can't ignore, that this was going on at the same time that the shroud emerged in the historical record. It decimated, it decimated folks. And the weather, if you look, if the climate at the time, it was quite wet and it was cold. And so it was just miserable.
Mm,
Especially when you have the English banging on your door that they're going to be invading at any moment. So they were really trapped, and there was no real way out. And so I believe that, and so that created, that fostered a certain devotion to the passion, even more so that already existed. There was a fringe group called the Flagellants. If you've seen Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, they're depicted there, where they go from town to town as this kind of parade, and they're doing self mortification with and so, which was condemned by the official church. But and it just showed that that was a very visceral way of connecting with the passion. There was also mystics who would recreate the passion to some extent in their own way, which is very interesting. That's part of what I encountered in my research that I put in the book. So all this heightened awareness at a miserable time during war and famine and plague, um, that this shroud emerges as a way, as a symbol of not only connecting, one can identify with that, but one could also find hope in that, as
mm,
both a symbol of the crucifixion and a symbol of the resurrection at the same time.
yeah,
So
yeah.
when they hold the shroud up, are they holding it up as a symbol of here, you know, behold the man, or is it a symbol of he is risen? You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's interesting too.
Well, and that's kind of the one thing that I always have it's not a big deal, but quite often you see the three crosses as a symbol of Christ and the empty crosses as a symbol of Christ, when in reality it should be the empty tomb. It's the empty tomb because it's the empty tomb that proves the resurrection and that there is life after death. Whereas the empty crosses just mean that the bodies were taken down. It's the empty tomb that's really the that symbol.
And
So
that is the symbol that drove the medieval mind, that
and
drove
that's where the shroud comes in, because that
right.
is, that was, that is, so to speak, the only witness to that moment of resurrection, where where that image was then imparted onto the cloth.
I will say this quickly, but based on what you just said, it's very interesting in this particular part of France. It's not just that the shroud emerges in that particular, it's not, I don't believe it's a random coincidence that the shroud emerged there. Why? Because this is also where the Crusades were launched
Mm,
in 1095. It was where the Templars were formed in about 1118. And the whole point of the Templars was to protect the Holy Sepulchre, you know, to devote themselves to
mm,
to keeping that as the most sacred spot in Christendom. It's also, and then ultimately it's where the shroud comes out years later. So you have this recurring sepulchrean theme emerge out of that particular part of Champagne, France, that the shroud ultimately kind of concludes that series of events that transpire there. Also, it's where the great cathedrals
mm.
were built, and those are all testimonies to, again, to the Holy Sepulchre. That's what is that but commemorating the Passion of Christ? What is
Yeah,
church?
yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
there are right around that area. And then, of course, in France, you've got the Notre Dame of Paris, but then you've also got the Notre Dame of Rien. You got the Notre Dame. There's like five or six huge cathedrals. And they, so that investment right around that time in the 1100s or so is when France, maybe economically as well, but France economically then had the money and the power and then the devotion to be able to invest in these enormous works like that. So that makes a lot of sense. When did the flagellants start? When do you think they came to being?
Yeah, they time about 1349.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
Okay.
not just that year, but that era. But they were
Yeah.
condemned. They corresponded with the rise of the plague, and
Mm.
they were condemned by the Pope as, as too extreme.
Yeah.
So it was a
Yeah.
fringe
Yeah.
group that traveled from town to town. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
in the Seventh Seal. If you ever get around to that classic film.
Yeah. Yeah. And then they were in the oh, that one with Tom Hanks as well. There was the guy there that was doing the flagellation, self-flagellation. Yeah. It's interesting too, though, that they used a three-pronged whip on themselves. And where would they get the idea of a three-pronged whip? Possibly then from the shroud with all of the three-pronged wounds from his own scourging.
I didn't think of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, we've got a break. We're coming to a close here, but wow, very interesting. Is there any last thing you'd like to say? And before we close?
I would just quickly encourage folks, if they want to also pursue another avenue. I mentioned John de Boinville, who was Charnet's grandfather. He in 1300 he accompanied, I believe it was his daughter, to a wedding. Uh, in 1300, and guy, help me here. It's not Alsace, but it's
It's Alsace, Alsace,
okay,
Alsace.
Alsace.
Yeah.
If you look at that particular area
Hmm.
of France, there is a huge devotion to the recumbent Christ.
Mm,
The same sort of figure of Christ that we see on the shroud and in the epitafios, etc. What's interesting about this is they're wood, life-size sculptures, very detailed, very very gruesome. I mean, very violent.
mm, mm,
One looks at that and you start seeing a lot of similarities with with the violence that you see on the shroud. It's a huge devotion that was going on in that particular area. I would encourage people to look that up. Look up recumbent Christ
mm,
in Alsace, and it's quite interesting. And De Joinville, we know, was there in 1300. He certainly would have seen the beginnings of these things. And I will quickly say this occurred later than the shroud, and this was more about 15th and 16th century. But there's a ton of if you go to any of these churches that you mentioned, all the churches throughout this particular area, there's entombment sculptures, which is
mm,
basically the sculpture of the recumbent Christ surrounded by the figures, say, of Joseph of Arimathea, or the three women and Nicodemus. Sometimes these are powerful, moving images that I really would like people to know more about as a devotion. I mean, amazing sculptures, but again, another example of just how prominent, uh, you know, the tomb was in
mm.
this time.
Well, and like you're saying, the recumbent Christ, because if you lay the shroud out, that is the image of the recumbent Christ in the tomb. For the listeners, Alsace, just as an aside, geographically, Alsace is kind of on that corner elbow there of northeastern France. It's an area that, and I don't know, it's probably much later than the time period you're talking about, where Germany and France went back and forth as to who owned it. And a lot of the Alsatians speak German, and because of the German influence right next door on the Rhine River there, and so then it's kind of a fascinating area, but and now for the topic here, it makes a lot of sense that it all kind of fits in.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It was one of the great discoveries, that I found. It's really mind-boggling. And one of the great things about research and the
Yeah,
historical record is there's always something ready to be discovered. It's
that
really
is so true.
yeah.
That and that's that is so true. One of the things though that I think is hard for shroud research is that there are so many different discoveries of things out there but the knowledge of those discoveries and being able to then transmit them to all the other shroud researchers is very difficult. And so you have then different pieces of of what you have and what others have, and bringing them all together to kind of put the jigsaw puzzle together of, well, it may have been here, it may have been there, it may have gone from here to there with Jeffrey de Charny or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
It's such a fascinating topic. I can't. I've been sucked in, and I don't know if I'm ever going to get out.
Yeah. Well, you've
Yeah.
done great work with what you're doing. So in a way, you're sort of the nexus point for all of these.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I don't know if I'm the nexus, but maybe I'm a mini nexus.
There you go. But I appreciate what you're doing. It's amazing how many guests you've gotten, and I hope you keep it up.
Yeah, thank you. No, I absolutely plan to. Well, but with that, then unfortunately, we've got to close here. But James, thank you so much. It's been awesome. And is there anywhere where you want people to find out more about you or some of your other books or other writings? Where can they find out more about you?
Well, I don't really have a website or a social media presence, but you can just type in James Day Shroud of Turin, and my articles will show up at various, mostly
Yeah,
Catholic sites. National Catholic Register might have some good ones,
yeah.
but it'll show up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it does. I typed it in as I was preparing for today, and you've got a handful of blogs and a handful of this, and definitely the National Catholic Register, if I can get my tongue to work. The National Catholic Register definitely has a handful of articles that you've written. James, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It's been enlightening and always interesting, and look forward to maybe talking again when your book is about to come out. Uh, for my listeners, please stay tuned, of course, for other videos in this series. As James said, there's a bunch of them, and there's a bunch of really cool information coming out, and I think it's just a great way for all of us to learn about what's going out there, certainly in the Shroud world, and then certainly in Shroud and Christianity as it all comes together. And otherwise, if you'd like to learn more about my book, it's The Only Witness, a Christian historical fiction on the Shroud of Turin, and you can find that on Amazon. In any case, James, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Guy. It was an honor.